A deserted road, a fragile cry, and a cruel decision. A mother abandons her baby to fend for itself. But the unexpected happened. A dog, guided by instinct, took an action no one could have imagined. What it did will leave you speechless. The winter wind howled through the Rocky Mountains like a mournful song, its icy fingers reaching through the dense forest that bordered the deserted highway. In the pale moonlight, a silver sedan pulled to a stop at the edge of the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness before falling silent. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the wilderness. Emily Warner stepped out, her hands trembling as she held a small bundle wrapped in a worn blue blanket. Tears streamed down her face, freezing against her cheeks in the bitter cold. The bundle stirred, and a soft whimper emerged from within. Emily pressed her lips to her baby's forehead one last time, inhaling his sweet scent, trying to memorialize every detail of his tiny face. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. We'll keep going. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "One day, you'll understand. This is the only way to keep you safe." She placed the bundle gently on the ground, making sure the blanket was securely tucked around him. Her heart shattered with each step she took back toward the car, Ethan's cries growing louder, calling her back. As Emily drove away, her headlights illuminated a pair of reflective eyes watching from the tree line. Guardian, a magnificent German shepherd with unusual intelligence in his gaze, emerged from the shadows. He approached the crying infant with careful steps, his powerful frame moving with surprising gentleness. The dog's ears perked forward as he studied the baby, sensing something extraordinary about this small human that went beyond the physical realm. Miles away in a cozy cabin nestled among the pines, Hannah Carter sat by the fireplace, absently running her fingers over the latest negative pregnancy test. Her husband Jack worked in silence nearby, crafting another piece of furniture they didn't need, the rhythmic sound of his sanding filling the room. They'd stopped talking about their disappointments months ago, but the weight of their unfulfilled dreams hung heavy in the air between them. A scratch at the door broke through their quiet evening routine. When Jack opened it, they found Guardian standing there, the bundle containing baby Ethan carefully placed at his feet. The dog's eyes met Hannah's, and in that moment something inexplicable passed between them, her understanding that transcended species. Hannah lifted Ethan from the ground, and as soon as she cradled him in her arms, the baby's cries softened to gentle coos. Jack wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, and they both knew without speaking a word that their lives had changed forever. Guardian sat at their feet, his posture alert and protective, as if he'd appointed himself the child's eternal guardian. In the days that followed, the Carters made discreet inquiries about abandoned babies in the area, but no reports matched their situation. They knew they should notify the authorities, but something held them back. Perhaps it was the way Ethan seemed to belong in their home from the very first moment, or the mysterious circumstances of his arrival with Guardian, who refused to leave the baby's side. As weeks turned into months, strange occurrences began to manifest around Ethan. Hannah noticed first the withered houseplants that suddenly flourished when Ethan crawled past them, the way birds would gather at his nursery window, singing songs that seemed meant only for him. Even as an infant, there was something different about the way he interacted with the natural world. Guardian remained a constant presence, watching over Ethan with an intensity that sometimes unnerved visitors. The dog seemed to understand things before they happened, positioning himself between Ethan and potential dangers before they manifested. When Ethan took his first steps, Guardian was there, providing a steady support for tiny hands to grasp. 5 years passed in their mountain sanctuary, and Ethan grew into a curious and gentle child. His connection to nature became more pronounced with each passing season. Flowers would bloom out of season in his presence, and wild animals would approach him without fear. Jack and Hannah watched in wonder, sharing knowing looks that acknowledged their son's uniqueness without needing to speak of it. One autumn morning, as golden leaves danced on the wind, a new family moved into the old Peterson farm down the valley. They brought with them a quiet boy named Ryan, who seemed to share none of his parents' enthusiasm for their new home. From his bedroom window, Ethan watched the moving trucks with curiosity, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Guardian sat beside him, his ears forward, as if he too sensed the significance of this arrival. Neither boy could have known that their meeting would set in motion events that would challenge everything they understood about themselves and the mysterious forces that shaped their lives. As the sun set behind the mountains that evening, casting long shadows across the valley, Guardian's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if he could see the threads of destiny beginning to weave themselves together. The first day of school brought with it a nervous energy that even Guardian could feel. The German shepherd watched from the porch as Hannah adjusted Ethan's backpack, smoothing his unruly dark hair one last time. Jack stood nearby, pretending to be occupied with his morning coffee while secretly recording the moment on his phone. At 7 years old, Ethan was about to start second grade at Mountain View Elementary, and for the first time, he wouldn't be the only new student in his class. Guardian's ears perked up before anyone else heard the approaching bus. As it rounded the corner, Ethan's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Hannah knelt beside him, straightening his collar. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. Your connection with nature is a special gift, but—" "I know, Mom," Ethan interrupted with a wisdom beyond his years. "Not everyone understands, so I need to be careful." He glanced at Guardian, who had moved closer, pressing against his leg in silent support. The bus stopped, its doors opening with a hydraulic hiss. Ethan climbed aboard, finding most seats already occupied by chattering students. Near the back, he spotted an empty space next to a boy he recognized from the moving trucks, Ryan Peterson, whose dark eyes seemed to be studying everything and nothing at the same time. As Ethan slid into the seat, Ryan didn't look up from the window, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "The sparrow outside is worried about her nest," he murmured, so quietly Ethan almost missed it. "The wind's picking up and she thinks it might rain." Ethan blinked in surprise. He'd been watching that same sparrow all morning, sensing her anxiety, but he'd never met anyone else who could do the same. Before he could respond, Ryan finally turned to face him, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. "You can feel it too, can't you? The way they speak without words." A warm current of recognition passed between them, and Ethan found himself nodding. "Not just the animals," he whispered back. "The trees, the flowers, and everything has a voice if you know how to listen." The bus jolted forward, but neither boy noticed the movement. They were too absorbed in their discovery of each other, years of isolation melting away in the space of a few sentences. Ryan's usual reserve cracked into a tentative smile. "Yesterday, I heard the old oak tree by our house telling stories about a storm from 50 years ago. My parents thought I was making things up." "My parents understand," Ethan said, thinking of Hannah's gentle guidance and Jack's proud smiles when he helped their garden flourish. "They're different too, in their own way. And then there's Guardian." Ryan's eyes lit up with interest. "The German shepherd. I saw him when we were moving in. He's not like other dogs, is he?" Ethan shook his head, lowering his voice further. "He's special. Sometimes I think he knows things before they happen. He brought me to my parents when I was a baby." The conversation paused as the bus stopped to pick up more students, but the connection between Ethan and Ryan had already taken root. Throughout the school day, they gravitated toward each other, sharing meaningful glances whenever their classmates failed to notice the butterfly that kept landing on their window with messages from far away, or the way the classroom plants seemed to stretch toward them during quiet reading time. At recess, while other children played basketball and chased each other across the playground, Ethan and Ryan sat under an ancient maple tree, sharing secrets they'd never dared tell anyone else. Ryan described how he could sense approaching dangers, like the time he'd pulled his little sister away from a hiding snake before anyone saw it. Ethan demonstrated his ability by touching a patch of bare earth, causing tiny wildflowers to sprout between his fingers. "We should explore the mountains," Ryan suggested, his eyes shining with excitement. "There must be so many secrets out there, things that only we can understand." Ethan thought about Guardian and how the dog always seemed to be guiding him towards something, as if there were mysteries waiting to be discovered. "We could start this weekend. Guardian knows all the safe paths and he's an amazing guide." As they made their plans, neither boy noticed the subtle changes happening around them. The maple tree's leaves had begun to glow with an unusual luminescence, and a circle of mushrooms had sprouted in a perfect ring around where they sat. Nature itself seemed to be responding to their combined presence, creating patterns that wouldn't be visible to ordinary eyes. The school day ended too quickly for both boys, but they made plans to meet the following Saturday for their first expedition. As Ethan climbed off the bus at his stop, he felt Ryan's awareness following him through the eyes of a hawk circling overhead. Guardian was waiting at the end of the driveway, and Ethan could have sworn the dog was smiling. That night, as Hannah tucked him into bed, Ethan couldn't contain his excitement. "I made a friend today, Mum. A real friend who understands." Hannah sat on the edge of his bed, sharing a knowing look with Guardian, who had taken his usual position by Ethan's door. "Tell me about him," she said, noticing how the potted plants on Ethan's windowsill seemed to lean closer, as if they too wanted to hear about this new development. As Ethan described his day, the night breeze carried the sound of distant wolves howling in the mountains. Ryan, lying in his own bed miles away, listened to their song and smiled, understanding their message of welcome. Something ancient was stirring in the Rocky Mountains, awakened by the convergence of two young souls whose gifts were far more significant than either of them yet realized. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual stillness in the air. Guardian was already waiting by the front door when Ethan came downstairs, the dog's tail wagging with barely contained excitement. Through the kitchen window, Ethan could see Ryan making his way up the mountain path, following the route they'd planned during their whispered conversations at school. "Be careful out there," Hannah called from the kitchen, trying to mask her concern with a smile. "And remember, stay where Guardian can see us," Ethan finished, having heard this reminder countless times. Jack looked up from his newspaper, exchanging a knowing glance with his wife. They'd noticed the subtle changes in their son since meeting Ryan, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. The moment Ryan reached the front porch, Guardian's behavior shifted. The dog moved between the boys with purposeful steps, nudging them away from their planned hiking route and toward a less traveled path that wound deeper into the mountains. Ryan and Ethan shared a look of understanding. Guardian wasn't just leading them on a walk, he was taking them somewhere specific. "The animals are quieter today," Ryan observed as they followed Guardian's lead. "It's like they're holding their breath, waiting for something." He paused, head tilted slightly. "Even the birds are speaking in whispers." Ethan nodded, feeling the same tension in the way the trees swayed. The forest itself seemed to be guiding them, branches bending to clear their path, roots shifting beneath their feet to prevent stumbles. After about an hour of hiking, they reached a section of the mountain neither boy had seen before. A curtain of vines hung before them, swaying despite the still air. Guardian sat down, looking expectantly at the boys. Ryan stepped forward first, his hand outstretched toward the vines. "There's something behind here," he whispered. "I can hear." "Music?" "No, not music exactly. More like pulses." As Ethan joined him, the vines parted on their own, revealing the entrance to a cave. But this was unlike any cave they'd ever seen in their mountain explorations. The walls seemed to shimmer with faint, iridescent patterns that moved like northern lights trapped in stone. Guardian led them inside, his white fur taking on the ethereal glow of the cave walls. "Look at this," Ethan breathed, touching one of the walls. Beneath his fingers, the patterns brightened, forming what appeared to be ancient symbols. "They're responding to us." Ryan moved deeper into the cave, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. "The voices are stronger in here, not animal voices. Something older, something that's been waiting." In the center of the cave, mounted on a natural stone pedestal, they found a crystal, unlike anything they'd ever seen. About the size of a football, it was completely transparent, except for a soft, pulsing light at its core that seemed to beat in rhythm with their hearts. As they approached, the crystal's glow intensified. Ethan reached out instinctively, his fingers barely brushing the crystal's surface. Immediately, a vision flooded his mind, a woman with his eyes and dark hair standing in this very cave years ago. She was crying but smiling too, placing her hand on the crystal just as he was doing now. Though he'd never seen her before, his heart recognized her instantly. "Mom," he whispered. Simultaneously, Ryan staggered back, overwhelmed by voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The balance," he gasped, translating the ancient whispers. "They keep talking about maintaining the balance. There are more crystals, Ethan." This isn't the only one. Guardian's bark echoed through the cave, snapping both boys back to the present moment. The dog's ears were erect, his posture alert. Through Ryan's connection, they sensed what Guardian had already noticed, the distant sound of helicopters approaching the mountain. Outside the cave, the boys could see 2 black helicopters passing overhead, carrying equipment they'd never seen before. Large metal containers dangled beneath them, heading toward the valley on the other side of the mountain. "Something's wrong," Ryan said, his voice tight with concern. "The animals are scared. Whatever's in those containers, it's disrupting their natural patterns." As if confirming Ryan's words, the crystal's pulsing light became erratic. Ethan could feel the distress radiating from it, echoing through the very rocks around them. Guardian led them back to the cave's entrance, positioning himself protectively in front of the boys as they watched the helicopters disappear behind the mountain ridge. "We need to come back," Ethan said firmly. "There's something important here, something we need to understand." He looked at the crystal one last time, its light now returned to its steady pulse. I think this might be why Guardian brought me to my parents that night. Why he stayed with me all these years." Ryan nodded, still processing the voices he'd heard. "They said something about guardians, not just your guardian, but others. Protectors chosen to watch over these crystals. And now, I think we might be part of that too." As they made their way back home, the forest seemed different, charged with new meaning. Every rustling leaf and animal call felt like a message they were only beginning to understand. Behind them, the vines gracefully closed over the cave entrance, hiding it once more from the world. What they didn't know was that in a sleek office in Denver, Diana Whitmore was reviewing satellite data that had detected unusual energy signatures in the Rocky Mountains, signatures that matched exactly what she'd been searching for her entire career. The next morning, her company would announce its plans to establish mining operations in the area, setting in motion events that would challenge everything Ethan and Ryan thought they knew about their gifts. The Monday following their cave discovery brought changes that rippled through the mountain community like a stone disturbing still water. A convoy of sleek black vehicles wound their way up the mountain roads, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun. At their head was a silver Tesla, driven by a woman whose presence commanded attention even from behind tinted windows. Diana Whitmore stepped out of her car with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making entrances. Her tailored suit and steel-gray hair spoke of corporate power, but it was her eyes that drew attention, sharp and calculating, missing nothing as she surveyed the landscape. The town hall meeting she'd called had drawn nearly every resident of the small mountain community, filling the modest building to capacity. "Progress," Diana began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the room, "doesn't have to come at the expense of tradition." Behind her, a holographic display showed ambitious renders of what she called an eco-conscious mining facility. Whitmore Industries isn't just proposing a mining operation. "We're offering to put your beautiful community on the map, to bring jobs, infrastructure, and prosperity." From their seats near the back, Ethan and Ryan exchanged worried glances. They'd convinced their parents to let them attend after sensing the unusual agitation among the local wildlife that morning. Guardian sat alertly in the aisle beside them, his eyes never leaving Diana. "The energy signatures we've detected in these mountains," Diana continued, gesturing to complex geological surveys, "suggest the presence of unique mineral deposits, minerals that could revolutionize clean energy technology. Imagine being part of something that could change the world." As she spoke, Ethan felt a strange heaviness in his chest, like the air itself was becoming harder to breathe. Next to him, Ryan winced, pressing his hands against his ears as if trying to block out distressing sounds only he could hear. "The deer are leaving," Ryan whispered. "All of them. They say the ground doesn't feel right anymore." Ethan nodded, understanding what his friend meant. Since the arrival of Diana's convoy, he'd noticed the plants around town showing signs of stress, their usual vibrant energy becoming muted and confused. Even Guardian seemed affected, his fur standing slightly on end. Jack Carter stood up during the question period, his voice carrying the weight of generations of mountain knowledge. "These mountains have a delicate ecosystem, Ms. Whitmore. How can you guarantee your operations won't disturb that balance?" Diana's smile never wavered. "Mr. Carter, I presume. I've heard about your reputation as a conservationist. Perhaps you'd be interested in joining our environmental impact assessment team. We value local expertise." Her offer seemed genuine, but something in her tone made Guardian's ears flatten against his head. After the meeting, as families gathered in small groups to discuss this potential transformation of their community, Ethan and Ryan slipped away to their favorite spot behind the town hall. The ancient oak tree that had always welcomed them felt different today, its leaves trembling with an anxiety that had nothing to do with the wind. "We have to protect the crystal," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they start mining—" "It's worse than that," Ryan interrupted, his face pale. "During the meeting, I could hear the mountains themselves. They're connected, Ethan. All of them. The crystal we found is part of something bigger, something that keeps everything in balance." Guardian suddenly stood, his posture alert. Through the gathering crowd, they spotted Diana Whitmore walking directly toward them. The boys froze, but Guardian moved slightly forward, positioning himself between them and the approaching executive. "What a magnificent dog," Diana remarked, stopping at a respectful distance. Her eyes studied Guardian with an intensity that seemed out of place for casual admiration. "German Shepherd, isn't he? They're known for their intelligence and their protective instincts." "He's been with me since I was a baby," Ethan replied carefully, feeling Ryan's tension beside him. "How fascinating," Diana mused. "You know, I've always believed that animals can sense things we humans miss. They have a connection to the natural world that we've largely lost." She knelt down as if to offer her hand to Guardian, but the dog remained perfectly still, neither friendly nor aggressive, simply watchful. Rising smoothly, Diana reached into her jacket and produced 2 business cards, offering them to the boys. "Your fathers, Mr. Carter and Mr. Peterson, they both have valuable knowledge of these mountains. I hope they'll consider joining our environmental team. Perhaps you boys could help convince them. Young people often see the value of progress more clearly than their parents." As she walked away, Ryan grabbed Ethan's arm. "She knows something," he whispered urgently. "When she was talking about animals sensing things, it wasn't just casual conversation. She's looking for something specific." Ethan nodded, watching Diana's retreating figure. The business cards in their hands felt unusually heavy, and the embossed logo of Whitmore Industries seemed to shimmer in a way that reminded them of the cave's walls. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, unusual weather patterns began to develop. Clouds swirled in unnatural formations, and the wind carried sounds that made even the adults uneasy. In their respective homes, both boys lay awake, feeling the vibrations of heavy machinery being moved into position under the cover of darkness. Guardian paced restlessly in Ethan's room, occasionally pausing to look out the window toward the cave. The dog's behavior confirmed what both boys already knew. Their discovery of the crystal hadn't been a coincidence, and Diana Whitmore's arrival wasn't either. Something ancient was stirring in the mountains, and they had somehow become part of a story much bigger than themselves. Within a week of Diana Whitmore's arrival, the mountains began to change. The constant drone of machinery echoed through the valleys, and the nights were illuminated by powerful floodlights that made the stars seem dim in comparison. But it wasn't just the visible changes that concerned Ethan and Ryan. It was the subtle shifts that only they could perceive. "The flowers are blooming out of sequence," Ethan observed one morning, kneeling beside a patch of confused wildflowers that had burst into bloom months before their time. "It's like they can't feel the natural rhythms anymore." He placed his hand gently on the ground, trying to soothe the distressed plants, but even his touch couldn't fully calm their agitation. Ryan stood nearby, his face tense with concentration. "The birds' migration patterns are all wrong too. They're flying in circles, confused about which direction to take. And the wolves." He paused, listening to distant howls that carried messages of distress. "They're saying the heart of the mountain is crying." Guardian had become increasingly active, leading the boys to different locations around the mountains, always seeming to stay just ahead of Whitmore Industries' expanding operation. Each day after school, they would follow the dog's guidance, discovering more signs of the delicate balance being disrupted. On this particular afternoon, Guardian led them to a hidden valley they'd never seen before. As they descended the steep path, both boys gasped at what they found. A small lake, its surface perfectly still, reflected the sky like a mirror. But what caught their attention was the subtle glow emanating from beneath the water's surface. "Another crystal," Ethan breathed, recognizing the pulsing light that matched the one they'd found in the cave. But this one's rhythm seemed erratic, its glow fluctuating in distressed patterns. Ryan moved closer to the water's edge, his eyes closed in concentration. "It's connected to the other one," he said slowly, interpreting the ancient voices that whispered in his mind. "They're like a heartbeat for the mountains. But something's interfering with their rhythm." Before they could investigate further, the ground trembled beneath their feet. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of Whitmore's drilling equipment. Guardian's ears perked up, and he quickly began herding the boys away from the lake. As they retreated up the path, they saw ripples disturbing the lake's surface, the crystal's glow becoming increasingly unstable. Back in town, changes were becoming apparent to everyone, not just those with special abilities. Hannah noticed her garden vegetables withering despite perfect care, and Jack reported that the normally abundant wildlife had become scarce on his forest surveys. But it was during dinner at the Peterson house that evening that they received the most disturbing news. "I've accepted a position with Whitmore Industries," Ryan's father announced, his voice carrying a mix of pride and uncertainty. "They want me to head their environmental impact assessment team. With my background in geology, I can make sure they follow proper procedures." Ryan shot a panicked look at Ethan, who had been invited for dinner. Both boys knew that Ryan's father, despite his good intentions, couldn't possibly understand the true impact of what was happening. The crystal network that maintained nature's balance was beyond conventional scientific understanding. Later that night, in Ryan's room, they pored over maps of the mountain range, marking the locations of the two crystals they'd found. Guardian lay between them, his intelligent eyes following their movements as they worked. "There has to be a pattern," Ethan murmured, tracing lines between the points. "The cave, the lake. They're positioned like they're forming something." Ryan suddenly sat up straighter, his eyes wide. "Wait, when I hear the ancient voices, they keep mentioning something about a sacred geometry. What if the crystals are arranged in a specific pattern to maintain the balance?" Their theorizing was interrupted by a strange sound, a high-pitched tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Guardian jumped to his feet, fur bristling. Through the window, they could see unusual auroral lights dancing in the sky, despite being far too south for such phenomena. "Whitmore's machines," Ryan whispered, interpreting the distressed messages flooding his mind from the local wildlife. "They must be getting closer to another crystal." Ethan pressed his palm against Ryan's bedroom floor, connecting with the plants outside. "The trees are afraid," he reported grimly. "Something's changing in the soil, in the air itself. It's like the natural world is holding its breath, waiting for something to break." Guardian moved to the window, pawing at the glass and whining softly. The dog's behavior had become increasingly urgent over the past few days, as if he was trying to prepare them for something. But prepare them for what? Their attention was drawn to a commotion outside. Diana Whitmore's convoy was returning from the day's operations, but this time, one of the trucks was carrying something different. A large metallic container that hummed with an energy both boys could feel in their bones. As the vehicles passed Ryan's house, all the electronics briefly flickered, and Guardian let out a low growl. "They found one," Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. "They found another crystal. Can you feel it, Ethan? It's screaming." In that moment, both boys understood that time was running out. Whatever balance the crystals maintained was beginning to falter, and they were perhaps the only ones who could prevent a catastrophe that most people didn't even know was possible. Guardian's eyes met theirs with an ancient wisdom, and they knew their real journey was only just beginning. The weekend couldn't come fast enough for Ethan and Ryan. After witnessing Whitmore Industries transport what they believed to be a crystal, they knew they needed to act. Guardian seemed to share their urgency, appearing at Ryan's window before dawn on Saturday morning, his presence awakening both boys to the day's importance. Hannah caught them as they were preparing to leave, her eyes filled with knowing concern. She handed them a backpack filled with supplies. "Guardian's never led you wrong before," she said softly, surprising the boys with her implicit understanding. "But please be careful. The mountains feel different lately." As they followed Guardian deeper into the wilderness than they'd ever ventured before, the dog's path seemed to trace a deliberate pattern. They noticed he would stop at certain points, waiting for them to catch up, his eyes fixed on specific landmarks that seemed ordinary at first glance. "Look at this," Ryan said, pulling out the map they'd marked with the crystal locations. "Guardian's taking us in a spiral pattern. Each stop is exactly 60 degrees from the last one, forming a perfect hexagon around the mountain's center." Ethan knelt to touch the ground at one of the stopping points and immediately pulled his hand back in surprise. "There's energy here. Not as strong as the crystals, but it's like an echo of them." He placed his palm down again, more prepared this time. "It's moving in patterns, flowing between the points we've found." Guardian led them to a ridge overlooking a vast section of the mountain range. From this vantage point, they could see several of Whitmore's operation sites scattered across the landscape. But what caught their attention was how the morning light revealed something they hadn't noticed before: subtle lines in the terrain, ancient pathways that connected various points in the mountains. "The ley lines," Ryan gasped, the ancient voices in his mind suddenly becoming clearer. "That's what they've been trying to tell me. The crystals aren't just random deposits. They're placed at intersection points of natural energy flows." As if confirming Ryan's revelation, Guardian barked and led them to a hidden crevice in the rocks. Inside, they found ancient petroglyphs depicting a pattern they immediately recognized: a complex geometric design showing points of light connected by flowing lines. In the center of the design was a larger crystal, surrounded by 6 smaller ones. "It's a map," Ethan breathed, comparing the ancient drawing to their marked-up modern map. "The crystals we found, they're part of this larger pattern. But look, Whitmore's main drilling site is right where this central crystal should be." A distant explosion made them all jump. Even from miles away, they could feel the reverberations through the ground. Guardian's ears flattened against his head, and Ryan doubled over, overwhelmed by the surge of panicked messages from the wildlife. "They're getting closer to the heart crystal," Ryan said through gritted teeth. "The animals. They're saying the mountain's song is becoming discordant. If they reach it..." The sky above them suddenly darkened, though it was barely noon. Unnatural clouds began forming in spiral patterns, and the wind carried the scent of ozone. Ethan reached out to the nearest trees, trying to calm them, but their distress was too intense. "We need to find the other crystals before they do," Ethan declared, studying the petroglyph map intently. "If we understand the pattern, maybe we can protect them somehow." Guardian nudged their hands, drawing their attention to a particular section of the ancient map. There, barely visible, was a small symbol that looked like a rising sun. Ryan's eyes widened as he interpreted its meaning. "The altar," he whispered. "The voices keep mentioning an altar in the mountains. It's where the knowledge of the crystals was kept. Guardian wants to show us something there." As they prepared to follow Guardian to this new location, a familiar Tesla wound its way up the mountain road below them. Even from this distance, they could see Diana Whitmore standing outside her vehicle, looking up at the strange weather patterns with an expression of triumph rather than concern. "She knows more than she's letting on," Ryan said, picking up fragments of thoughts from the workers at the distant mining sites. "They're not just mining for ordinary minerals. She's searching for something specific, something about the crystal's energy." The wind suddenly picked up, carrying with it the distressed songs of 1,000 displaced birds. The trees around them swayed unnaturally, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to point the way. Guardian stood alert, his fur rippling in the electromagnetic disturbance that seemed to be building in the air. "We're running out of time," Ethan said, feeling the growing instability in every plant and tree around them. Whatever these crystals do, whatever balance they maintain, it's starting to fall apart. Guardian began leading them along a nearly invisible path, one that seemed to shimmer slightly in the strange light. Behind them, more explosions echoed through the mountains, each one sending ripples of distress through the natural world. But ahead, barely visible through the gathering storms, a structure of ancient stones beckoned them toward what they hoped would be answers. What they didn't realize was that Diana Whitmore's instruments had detected their presence, registering unusual energy signatures that matched what she'd been studying her entire career. As she watched the boys' distant figures through high-powered binoculars, a smile played across her face. Everything was proceeding exactly as she'd planned. The path to the altar grew steeper and more treacherous with each step. Guardian moved with practiced ease, choosing routes that would keep the boys safe from the increasingly unstable terrain. The air had become thick with electromagnetic energy, making their skin tingle and their hair stand on end. As they climbed higher, ancient stone markers began to appear along the trail. Each one bore symbols similar to those they'd seen in the cave, but these seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that grew stronger as they approached their destination. Ryan paused at each marker, his gift allowing him to translate fragments of their ancient messages. Their warnings, he explained, his voice hushed with awe, and instructions. Each stone talks about the balance, how the crystals work together to keep the natural world in harmony. But there's something else. He pressed his hand against the latest marker, closing his eyes in concentration. They keep mentioning chosen ones, people with special connections to nature's forces. Ethan felt a resonance with Ryan's words. Since they'd started their climb, his awareness of the plant life around them had intensified. He could sense the complex network of roots beneath their feet, all vibrating with an energy that seemed to flow toward their destination. Guardian suddenly stopped, standing at attention before a sheer rock face that appeared to be a dead end. But as the boys watched, the dog pressed his nose against a specific point on the stone, and a previously invisible seam began to glow. The rock face slowly parted, revealing a hidden passage that led to a circular chamber carved directly into the mountain. The altar room took their breath away. Crystalline formations grew from the walls and ceiling, their light pulsing in a synchronized rhythm that made the entire chamber feel alive. In the center stood an ancient stone table, its surface carved with intricate patterns that matched the map they'd found earlier. "Look at this," Ethan called out, studying the altar's surface. Embedded in the stone were 7 shallow depressions arranged in the same pattern as the crystals on their map. The central depression was larger than the others, and all of them seemed to be connected by channels carved into the rock. Ryan moved around the altar, his hand hovering over each depression as he listened to the voices that seemed strongest in this sacred space. "These aren't just holders for the crystals," he said slowly, piecing together the ancient messages. "They're like a key. When all the crystals are placed here, they can be synchronized to restore the natural balance." Guardian whined softly, drawing their attention to a section of wall that began to illuminate as they approached. Images appeared, projected by some unknown means onto the rock surface. They watched in amazement as the story of the crystals unfolded before them. The images showed the mountains in ancient times, when the first Guardians discovered the crystal's power to maintain harmony in the natural world. They saw how the crystals were carefully placed at specific points, creating a network of energy that sustained all life in the region. And they saw how certain individuals, people with gifts like theirs, were chosen to protect this sacred trust. "Ethan," Ryan said suddenly, pointing to a particular scene, "look at that woman. She looks just like my mother," Ethan finished, his heart racing. The projection showed a woman who was unmistakably his mother, standing before the altar with a baby in her arms. She placed her hand on one of the crystals, and the image showed energy flowing between her and the stone. Before they could process this revelation, a distant explosion shook the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the crystal's light flickered erratically. Guardian's posture became alert, his ears swiveling toward the sound. Through their respective gifts, both boys felt the impact of what was happening. Ethan could sense the plants outside recoiling in pain, while Ryan was overwhelmed by a chorus of panicked animal voices. The mountain itself seemed to tremble with distress. "They've reached another crystal," Ryan said grimly, interpreting the urgent messages flooding his mind. "This one was underwater, hidden in the lake we found. They're extracting it right now." Ethan pressed his hands against the altar, and immediately a connection formed. Through the stone, he could feel the pulse of every remaining crystal in the network. Each one's rhythm was becoming more erratic, struggling to maintain the balance as their numbers decreased. "We need to stop them," he said, a new determination in his voice. "But first, we need to understand exactly what these crystals do." "There must be more information here." Guardian barked in agreement, leading them to another wall of the chamber. This section was covered in more detailed inscriptions, and as they approached, the crystalline formations around them brightened, as if responding to their presence. Ryan began to translate, his eyes widening as he understood more of the ancient message. The crystals don't just maintain nature's balance, they're like anchors, holding something in place, something powerful and dangerous that lives deep within the mountain. If the crystal network fails, another explosion rocked the chamber, closer this time. Through the hidden entrance, they could hear the sound of machinery approaching. Guardian's fur stood on end, and he moved protectively in front of the boys. "They're following us," Ethan realized, remembering Diana's triumphant expression earlier. She must have known we'd lead her to something important. The chamber's crystals began pulsing more rapidly, their light taking on a reddish hue. Through their gifts, both boys could feel the mountain's warning. Time was running out, and the balance was reaching a critical point of instability. What they didn't know was that far below them, in Whitmore Industries' main facility, Diana stood before a bank of monitors displaying energy readings that exceeded her wildest expectations. On her central screen, a satellite image showed the location of the altar, marked by an intense energy signature that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the crystal they'd just extracted from the lake. "Found you," she whispered, a smile playing across her face as she picked up her phone. "Send in the extraction team. And hurry. We're not the only ones who know what we're looking for anymore." The sound of approaching helicopters echoed through the altar chamber, their rhythmic beating creating an ominous counterpoint to the crystal's pulsing light. Guardian's posture became more alert, his ears tracking the multiple threats converging on their location. "We need to hide," Ryan whispered, but Ethan shook his head, placing his hand back on the altar. "No," he said, with unexpected certainty. "We need to understand, now." The moment his fingers touched the ancient stone, the chamber's illumination intensified. The crystalline formations in the walls began to pulse in sequence, creating a circular pattern of light that spiraled toward the ceiling. Ryan gasped as the voices in his mind suddenly became crystal clear, no longer fragments, but a coherent message. "The crystals," he translated, his voice taking on an otherworldly tone. "They're not just maintaining balance. They're containing something that lives in the space between spaces, in the realm where nature's forces originate." Guardian moved to the center of the chamber, his white fur glowing with reflected light. As the dog sat beside the altar, his presence seemed to amplify the energy flowing through the room. The projections on the walls changed, showing new images that moved with fluid grace. They saw a time long ago when the mountains were young, when forces of nature existed in their purest form. These forces, neither good nor evil, but wild and unbridled, needed to be balanced, contained within boundaries that would allow life to flourish. The crystals were created as anchor points, their sacred geometry forming a network that maintained these boundaries. "That's why my mother brought me here," Ethan realized, watching as the images showed her again. "She knew what I would become, what we would both become." He looked at Ryan, understanding dawning in his eyes. Ryan nodded, still translating the ancient messages. "We're not just random kids with special abilities. We're meant to be the new Guardians. That's why Guardian brought you to the Carters, why he's been preparing us all this time." The chamber shuddered as another explosion rocked the mountain. Through his connection with the altar, Ethan could feel the crystal network becoming increasingly unstable. Each extraction by Whitmore's team weakened the boundaries, allowing the ancient forces to slip through in ways that manifested as the strange weather patterns and natural disturbances they'd been witnessing. "Diana doesn't understand what she's doing," Ryan said urgently, picking up fragments of thoughts from the approaching extraction team. "She thinks the crystals are just energy sources, something she can harness for power. She doesn't realize she's unplugging the anchors that keep our world stable." Guardian suddenly barked, a sound that reverberated through the chamber with unusual power. The dog's eyes began to glow with an inner light, and for the first time the boys understood what had been apparent in subtle ways throughout their lives. Guardian was more than just a dog. Through their respective gifts, they could finally see Guardian's true nature. He was a manifestation of the very forces the crystals helped to contain, a bridge between the physical world and the realm of pure natural energy. He had taken the form of a dog to guide and protect, to prepare them for this moment. "That's why you brought me to Jack and Hannah," Ethan said softly to Guardian. "You knew they would understand enough to let me grow into who I needed to be." The sound of repelling equipment could be heard outside the chamber's entrance. Time was running out. Guardian moved to stand between the boys, and as he did, his form began to shimmer with an ethereal light. Power flowed from him into Ethan and Ryan, amplifying their natural gifts to levels they had never experienced before. Ethan could suddenly feel every plant, every tree, every blade of grass on the mountain, all connected in a vast network of life that pulsed with sacred energy. Ryan's awareness expanded to encompass not just animal thoughts, but the very spirits of nature themselves, the ancient beings that danced between the physical and ethereal realms. "We have to complete the circle," Ryan said with sudden certainty, the ancient voices guiding his words. "The altar wasn't just for holding the crystals, it's a key to awakening the next generation of guardians, us." As the first members of Diana's extraction team appeared at the chamber entrance, Ethan and Ryan took their positions on either side of the altar. Guardian stood at its head, his form now barely containing the ancient power that flowed through him. The boys placed their hands on the altar's surface, and the chamber erupted with light. Diana Whitmore stepped into the chamber, just in time to witness something she had never anticipated in all her years of research. The boys seemed to glow from within, their forms outlined in pure energy, as the altar activated sequences that had laid dormant for generations. Guardian's form shifted between that of a dog and something far more primordial, a being of pure light that embodied the very forces Diana had been trying to understand and control. "Stop them," she commanded, but her team stood frozen, overwhelmed by the display of power before them. The crystals in the walls pulsed with increasing intensity, and the ancient inscriptions began to glow with a light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. What none of them realized was that this was only the beginning. The awakening of the new Guardians had set in motion events that would challenge not just Diana's plans, but the very understanding of what was possible when the ancient forces of nature found their true vessels of protection. The altar chamber had become a vortex of pure energy, with Ethan and Ryan at its center. Their transformation continued as ancient power flowed through them, guided by Guardian's presence. The crystalline formations in the walls thrummed with increasing intensity, responding to the awakening of the new Guardians. Diana Whitmore stood at the entrance, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of both fear and fascination. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, reaching for a sophisticated sensor device hanging at her belt. "The energy readings are off the charts." "This is exactly what I've been searching for." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Ryan called out, his voice carrying ethereal undertones as he channeled the ancient voices. "These forces were never meant to be controlled or harvested. They're part of the Earth's natural balance." Through his enhanced connection with nature, Ethan could feel the devastating effects of Diana's crystal extractions rippling through the mountain ecosystem. Plants were withering, animals were fleeing, and the very fabric of natural law was beginning to fray at the edges. The remaining crystals in the network were straining to maintain boundaries that were never meant to be breached. "Oh, but I understand more than you think," Diana replied, her voice taking on an edge of zealous intensity. "I've spent my entire life studying these energy patterns. The power contained in these mountains could revolutionize everything. Energy production, technology, medicine. Why contain such force when we could harness it?" Guardian's form shifted again, his light growing more intense. Through their enhanced awareness, both boys could now see what Diana couldn't: the dangerous tears forming in the natural fabric of reality where the crystal network had been weakened. Ancient forces were beginning to seep through, manifesting as the strange weather patterns and geological disturbances they'd been witnessing. "The crystals aren't an energy source," Ethan explained, trying to make her understand. "They're a containment system, keeping forces in balance that were never meant to be unleashed. Every crystal you remove..." He was cut off by a violent tremor that shook the entire chamber. Through the entrance, they could see unnatural aurora-like lights dancing across the sky, their colors shifting in impossible patterns. The wind outside had begun to move in spiral patterns, creating vortexes that defied natural law. Diana's team of technicians backed away from the entrance as the energy in the chamber continued to build. Their equipment was malfunctioning, screens flickering with readings that made no sense. But Diana stepped forward, her eyes locked on Guardian's luminous form. A manifested nature spirit, she whispered in awe. All these years, the legends were true. And you two, she turned to the boys, natural conduits, born with the ability to channel these forces. Join me. Think of what we could accomplish together. Guardian's response was immediate and powerful. A pulse of pure energy emanated from his form, creating a protective barrier around the boys and the altar. The ancient inscriptions on the walls blazed with renewed intensity, responding to the defense of their sacred purpose. Ryan's eyes widened as he received a flood of urgent messages from the mountain itself. "The containment is failing," he announced, his voice tight with concern. "The forces behind the veil. They're pushing through where the crystals have been removed. We have to restore the network before—" Another tremor, stronger than the last, interrupted him. Through their enhanced senses, both boys could feel the remaining crystals crying out in distress as they struggled to maintain the weakened boundaries. The very air seemed to shimmer with visible energy waves, reality itself bending under the strain. Diana stumbled as the ground shifted beneath her feet, but her determination didn't waver. "We've already extracted 3 crystals," she revealed, a note of triumph in her voice. "They're being analyzed in our facility right now. The energy they're producing is beyond anything we imagined possible. You have to return them," Ethan pleaded, feeling the mountain's pain through his connection with nature. "The whole network has to be restored, or the damage will be irreversible." Through their enhanced awareness, both boys could see threads of natural force beginning to unravel around them. Trees were growing and withering in moments, rocks were crystallizing and dissolving, and time itself seemed to flow strangely in pockets of distorted space. Guardian's light pulsed again, and both boys received a clear understanding of what needed to be done. They weren't just meant to be passive guardians of the crystal network, they were meant to be active participants in maintaining the balance. Their gifts, amplified by the altar's power, gave them the ability to repair what had been damaged. But first, they needed to recover the stolen crystals. As if reading their thoughts, Guardian's form began to shift once more, his energy extending to encompass both boys in a protective field. The ancient power that had awakened within them was building towards something momentous, a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the mountains, but the very balance of natural law itself. Diana watched this transformation with growing realization that she might have miscalculated. The power she had sought to control was revealing itself to be far more vast and complex than she had imagined. But she had come too far to back down now. As the chamber filled with increasingly intense light, both sides prepared for a clash between modern ambition and ancient wisdom, between the desire to control nature's forces and the sacred duty to maintain their balance. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path would prevail. The mountain air crackled with electromagnetic energy as Ethan, Ryan, and Guardian emerged from the altar chamber. Their newfound powers hummed through them like a living current, connecting them more deeply than ever to the forces of nature around them. Behind them, Diana Whitmore was already barking orders into her phone, mobilizing her resources for what she knew would be a decisive confrontation. "The facility is 3 miles north," Ryan said, interpreting messages from panicked wildlife fleeing the area. "The crystals are being held in some kind of containment units, but they're causing massive disruptions. The animals say the ground itself is crying." Ethan pressed his hand against a nearby tree, and his enhanced abilities showed him the full scope of the crisis. The natural energy flows that should have moved like rivers through the mountain were now fragmented and chaotic, creating pockets of distorted reality where the crystal network had been compromised. "Look," he pointed to a valley below, where a grove of ancient pines was cycling through seasons in minutes, leaves budding, growing, and falling in an accelerated loop. In another area, a small pond had frozen solid despite the warm temperature, its surface gleaming with impossible crystalline patterns. Guardian's luminous form pulsed with urgency. Through their strengthened connection, both boys understood that these reality distortions would only worsen as long as the crystal network remained incomplete. The ancient forces contained by the network were leaking through the weakened boundaries, causing nature's laws to break down in increasingly dangerous ways. As they made their way toward Whitmore's facility, they encountered more signs of the growing chaos. Birds flew in geometric patterns that defied physics, their migrations confused by the disrupted magnetic fields. Plants grew in twisted shapes, reaching toward energy sources that shouldn't exist in the physical world. The voices are getting louder, Ryan winced, overwhelmed by the chorus of distress calls from every living thing around them. They're not just afraid anymore. They're saying the veils between worlds are thinning. Things are crossing over that haven't walked these mountains in millennia. Their path was suddenly blocked by a phenomenon that stopped them in their tracks. A curtain of shimmering energy hung in the air, and through it, they could see glimpses of another reality, a version of the mountains as they existed in the realm of pure natural forces before the crystal network had been established to maintain balance. Guardian's light intensified as he created a protective barrier around them. Through this shield, they could safely observe the ethereal beings that were beginning to manifest, ancient nature spirits that had once roamed freely before being contained for the sake of earthly life's survival. "Now do you understand what you've unleashed?" Ethan called out to Diana, who had been following them with her team at a careful distance. These forces were contained for a reason. The physical world can't handle them in their pure form. Diana's expression was a mixture of scientific fascination and growing concern as she observed the reality distortions through her sophisticated equipment. "This is more than I anticipated," she admitted, though her voice still carried a note of ambition. "But think of the possibilities if we could learn to control these forces." A massive tremor shook the mountain, more violent than any before. In the distance, they could see Whitmore's facility, now surrounded by swirling vortexes of unnatural energy. The stolen crystals were reacting to the network's instability, their power amplified by the scientific equipment meant to study them. Through his connection with the plants, Ethan sensed a new danger. "The containment units in your lab," he called to Diana. "They're not just studying the crystals, they're amplifying their energy in ways that were never meant to happen. You're creating a feedback loop that's making the breakdown worse." Ryan suddenly staggered, overwhelmed by a surge of ancient voices. "The heart crystal," he gasped. "The one in the center of the network. It's directly below your facility, isn't it? That's why you built there." Diana's silence was confirmation enough. Guardian's form flickered with increased urgency, and both boys received a clear vision of what would happen if the heart crystal was exposed to the same amplification effects as the others. The entire crystal network would shatter, permanently rupturing the boundaries that kept natural forces in balance. The air around them began to shimmer with visible waves of energy, as reality itself became increasingly unstable. Time moved strangely. Moments stretched and compressed unpredictably. In some spots, they could see the past and future overlapping with the present, creating ghost images of what had been and what might be. "We have to reach those crystals," Ethan said with determination. "Guardian, can you help us get through these distortions?" The luminous being that had once appeared as a simple German shepherd responded by intensifying the protective field around them. Together, they began making their way through the chaos toward Whitmore's facility, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine the fate of not just the mountains, but the very fabric of natural law itself. Behind them, Diana watched their progress through her facility's security feeds, her lifetime of research and ambition warring with the undeniable evidence that she had disturbed something far more fundamental than she'd imagined. But she had one more card to play, something she'd discovered in her research that even the ancient guardians might not know about. The mountain trembled again, and in the deepening twilight, more tears in reality began to appear. Through these rifts, ancient forces that had been contained since the dawn of time began to stir, sensing the weakening of their age-old bonds. The race to prevent a catastrophe of cosmic proportions had begun. The approach to Whitmore's facility was like walking through a dream that had broken free of sleep's boundaries. Reality rippled around them in waves, each pulse bringing new impossibilities into being. The protective field Guardian maintained around them was the only thing keeping them anchored in normal space-time. "Look at the building," Ryan whispered, his enhanced senses overwhelmed by the waves of energy emanating from within. The modern structure seemed to shift between states of existence, one moment solid and real, the next almost transparent, revealing the swirling forces contained inside. Through the facility's windows, they could see Diana's research team scrambling to contain the growing chaos. The stolen crystals, held in highly sophisticated containment units, were pulsing with increasingly erratic patterns of light. Each pulse sent new ripples of distortion through the fabric of reality. Ethan pressed his hand against the earth, his connection to nature revealing the full scope of what was happening. "The heart crystal," he said, his voice tight with concern. "It's directly below us, and it's singing, like it's calling to the others." Guardian's luminous form flickered in response, and both boys received a clear vision of what lay beneath their feet. The heart crystal, larger than all the others, rested in a natural chamber deep within the mountain. It was the keystone of the entire network, and its song was a desperate attempt to restore harmony to the failing system. "We need to split up," Ryan said suddenly, interpreting urgent messages from the ancient voices that now spoke to him with crystal clarity. "The stolen crystals have to be returned to their proper places, but someone needs to protect the heart crystal. They're going to try to extract it. I can hear them preparing the equipment." Before they could formulate a plan, the main doors of the facility burst open. Diana emerged, but something was different about her. She wore what appeared to be a crystalline harness of her own design, its surface etched with patterns that mimicked the sacred geometry of the crystal network. "Remarkable, isn't it?" she called out, her voice carrying an unsettling resonance. "I've spent years studying the energy signatures of these mountains. Did you think you were the only ones who could channel these forces?" The harness she wore began to glow with an artificial light that caused Guardian to bristle, his protective field intensifying in response. Diana had found a way to tap into the crystal energy, but her method was crude and dangerous, forcing connections that were never meant to exist. "You're making it worse," Ethan tried to explain, feeling the mountain's pain through his connection with nature. "These forces can't be controlled through technology. The balance has to be maintained through harmony, not dominance." Around them, reality continued to fragment. Patches of accelerated time caused plants to grow and decay in seconds. Pockets of reversed gravity sent rocks floating upward into the darkening sky. The very air seemed to crystallize in places, forming lattices of frozen time and space. Through the chaos, Ryan received a sudden warning from deep within the mountain. "The extraction team," he gasped. "They've reached the chamber with the heart crystal. They're starting to drill." The moment the drilling began, everything changed. The reality distortions intensified exponentially. The boundary between the physical world and the realm of pure natural forces became paper-thin. Through the tears in space-time, they could see magnificent and terrible things. Ancient spirits of mountain and storm, beings of pure elemental force that had been contained by the crystal network for millennia. Guardian's form began to shift, growing larger and more luminous. The ancient spirit that had taken the form of a dog was revealing more of its true nature, preparing for what was to come. Both boys felt their own powers surge in response, their connection to the natural world deepening beyond anything they'd experienced before. Diana's harness crackled with energy as she attempted to assert control over the chaotic forces swirling around them. "Can't you see?" she called out, her voice distorting with power she couldn't fully contain. "With the right technology, we could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself." But her words were drowned out by a new sound, a deep resonance that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself. The heart crystal's song had changed from a call for harmony to a warning of imminent catastrophe. The very foundations of natural law were beginning to unravel. Ethan and Ryan shared a look of understanding. They had to act now, before the damage became irreversible. Guardian's light enveloped them completely, transforming them into beings that could move between the fragmenting layers of reality. The final confrontation was about to begin, but it would be fought not with violence, but with the fundamental forces of nature itself. As they prepared to make their move, time seemed to slow around them. In this moment of crystal clarity, they could see all the threads that had led to this point. Guardian finding Ethan as a baby, their discovery of their gifts, the ancient prophecies about new guardians who would rise when the balance was threatened. Everything had prepared them for this moment. The mountain trembled again, and the sky above began to crack like breaking glass, revealing the swirling chaos that lay beyond normal reality. The time for preparation was over. The final battle for balance was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just their fate, but the fate of the natural world itself. The interior of Whitmore's facility was a maze of shattered reality. Every corridor existed in multiple states simultaneously, and doorways opened into impossible spaces where the laws of physics had completely broken down. Guardian's protective field was the only thing allowing them to navigate through the chaos. "The crystals are in the main lab," Ryan translated, receiving guidance from the ancient voices that grew stronger with each passing moment. 2 levels down, but Diana's containment systems are amplifying their power in ways that were never meant to happen. Ethan could feel the stolen crystals' distress through his enhanced connection to nature. Their song, once part of a perfect harmony, had become a discordant cry that shook the foundations of reality itself. "We need to free them first," he said. "Get them back into the network before..." A tremendous surge of energy cut him off as Diana's drilling team breached the chamber of the heart crystal. The entire mountain shuddered, and for a moment, all of reality seemed to hold its breath. Then the chaos truly began. The barriers between worlds thinned to transparency. Through the walls of the facility, they could see layers of reality overlapping. The physical world, the realm of pure natural forces, and spaces between that human minds were never meant to comprehend. Ancient beings of pure energy began to slip through the weakening veils, their presence causing further distortions in the natural order. "Extraordinary, isn't it?" Diana's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. Her crystalline harness had transformed her into something that existed between states of being. "We're witnessing the birth of a new understanding of reality itself. Why contain these forces when we could evolve to embrace them?" Guardian's form pulsed with urgent light, and both boys received a clear vision of what would happen if the heart crystal was removed from its chamber. The entire network would collapse, and the carefully maintained boundaries between realms would shatter completely. The physical world would be overwhelmed by forces it was never meant to contain. Through his connection with nature, Ethan could feel every living thing on the mountain crying out in distress. Plants, animals, even the rocks themselves resonated with the wrongness of what was happening. The very fabric of existence was beginning to unravel. Ryan suddenly staggered, overwhelmed by a new chorus of voices. "The Ancient Ones," he gasped. "The first Guardians who created the Crystal Network. They're reaching through time itself to help us." His eyes glowed with otherworldly knowledge as he received their guidance. Guardian's light intensified, forming patterns that matched the sacred geometry they'd seen in the altar chamber. The ancient spirit that had taken dog form was preparing to reveal more of its true power, to help them restore what had been broken. The walls of the facility began to crystallize and dissolve as reality fluctuated wildly. Through the chaos, they could see the main lab where the stolen crystals were held. Diana stood at its center, her harness crackling with energy as she attempted to control forces that were never meant to be harnessed by technology. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Ethan called out, his voice carrying the resonance of nature itself. "These forces aren't meant to be controlled, they're meant to be in balance." "Balance is stagnation," Diana replied, her form flickering between states. "Humanity has always advanced by pushing boundaries, by harnessing what was thought to be unharnessable. Think of the possibilities." But even as she spoke, the consequences of her actions became impossible to ignore. Time began to fold in on itself. They could see moments from the past bleeding into the present, glimpses of the first Guardians placing the crystals, of Ethan's mother making her choice to protect him, of Guardian watching over the mountains through countless ages. The heart crystal's song reached a fever pitch as the drilling team prepared to extract it. Reality itself began to crack like breaking glass, revealing the swirling chaos that lay between worlds. Ancient nature spirits, neither good nor evil, but simply too pure and powerful for the physical realm, began to push through the weakening barriers. Guardian's light suddenly expanded, enveloping both boys in its radiance. Through their connection with the ancient spirit, they understood what needed to be done. The crystal network couldn't just be restored, it needed to be renewed, strengthened by a new generation of Guardians who understood both the physical world and the forces that shaped it. As they prepared to make their final move, time seemed to slow around them. In this moment of crystal clarity, they could see all the threads that had led to this point. Every choice, every moment of preparation, every step of the path that had brought them here. They were no longer just two boys with unusual gifts. They were the bridge between worlds, the new guardians of an ancient balance. The mountain trembled again, and the sky above the facility shattered completely, revealing the swirling energies that lay beyond normal reality. The time for action had come. With Guardian's power flowing through them, Ethan and Ryan prepared to face not just Diana, but the very forces of nature unleashed from their ancient bonds. In the chaos of the disintegrating facility, time and space bent around them like light through a prism. Guardian's protective field expanded, merging with Ethan and Ryan's enhanced abilities in a way that transformed them all. They were no longer separate entities, but a unified force of nature, their combined power resonating with the same frequency as the crystal network itself. "The containment units," Ryan called out, his consciousness now able to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously. "They're not just holding the crystals, they're forcing them to vibrate at artificial frequencies. That's what's causing the worst distortions." Through their shared awareness, they could see the true nature of Diana's technology. Her machines were attempting to synchronize with the crystal network's power, but they were like discordant instruments in what should have been a perfect symphony, creating interference patterns that threatened to shatter reality itself. Diana stood at her control center, her crystalline harness pulsing with stolen energy. "Look at what we've achieved," she exclaimed, gesturing to the swirling chaos around them. "We're breaking through the barriers that have limited humanity since the beginning of time." But even as she spoke, the consequences of her interference became devastatingly clear. The drill team's attempts to extract the heart crystal had created a resonance cascade. Every reality distortion was amplifying exponentially, and the ancient forces leaking through the weakening veils were beginning to take physical form. Ethan reached out with his enhanced connection to nature, feeling the pain of every living thing on the mountain. "The network wasn't designed to limit us," he tried to explain, his voice carrying the wisdom of countless generations of guardians. "It was created to protect both worlds, to keep the physical realm and the forces of pure nature in harmony." Through their unified consciousness, both boys suddenly received a vision of how the crystal network was meant to function. It wasn't a cage or a barrier, but a membrane, a living system that allowed the necessary flow of natural forces while preventing the kind of chaos that would destroy both realms. Guardian's light pulsed with ancient knowledge, showing them what needed to be done. The stolen crystals couldn't simply be returned to their places. The entire network needed to be reharmonized, tuned like an infinite instrument to play the symphony of natural law. Ryan's gift allowed him to hear the original frequency, the perfect resonance that had existed before Diana's interference. "We need to match that tone," he realized. "Not just with the crystals, but with ourselves. We're part of the harmony now." The facility's walls had become completely transparent, revealing the layers of reality that existed simultaneously. They could see the heart crystal in its chamber far below, its light flickering like a faltering heartbeat. Around them, the stolen crystals in their containment units pulsed with increasing desperation, trying to break free and return to their natural rhythm. Diana's harness suddenly sparked and crackled, the forces she was trying to control proving too powerful for her technology. "Something's wrong," she gasped, finally seeing the true magnitude of what she'd set in motion. "The readings are off the scale." Guardian's form expanded into pure light, enveloping both boys in an aura of ancient power. Through this connection, they could feel every crystal in the network, every force of nature seeking balance, every thread of harmony waiting to be restored. Ethan reached out to the plants and trees, not just on the mountain but throughout the region, drawing on their deep connection to natural law. Ryan opened himself to the voices of every living creature, from the smallest insect to the ancient spirits themselves, creating a chorus of life that resonated with primal truth. Together, they began to sing, not with their physical voices, but with their very beings. It was a song of balance, of harmony between forces, of the dance between physical form and pure energy that made all life possible. Guardian's light provided the foundation, the ancient tone that had maintained order since the beginning of time. The stolen crystals began to respond, their enforced frequencies giving way to their natural resonance. One by one, they shattered their containment units not with violence, but with the irresistible power of returning to their true nature. They rose into the air, their light pulsing in harmony with the boys' song. Diana watched in awe as her life's work transformed into something she had never imagined. Her harness, designed to control and contain, began to crack as the crystals reclaimed their power. But rather than destroy her, the forces she had tried to harness simply flowed around her, showing her a glimpse of the true harmony she had never understood. The heart crystal's chamber began to glow with renewed power as the network started to realign. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when harmony would be restored and balance would return to both realms. Through their unified consciousness, Ethan and Ryan understood that this was more than just fixing what had been broken. It was a renewal, a rebirth of the ancient system with new guardians who could bridge the gap between worlds. The symphony of natural law was about to play its most important movement. The song of harmony grew stronger, resonating through every layer of reality. Ethan and Ryan, their consciousness still merged with Guardian's ancient power, became pure channels for the forces of nature itself. The stolen crystals danced around them in complex geometric patterns, their light pulsing in perfect synchronization with the heart crystal deep below. Diana stood transfixed, her crystalline harness now completely dark, as the energy she had tried to harness returned to its natural flow. Through the transparent walls of reality, she could see the true pattern of the crystal network, not the rigid system of power she had imagined, but a living, breathing web of interconnected forces that maintained the delicate balance between worlds. "It's beautiful," she whispered, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. "All this time I thought I was trying to unlock a power source, but it was already working perfectly. We just couldn't see it." The heart crystal's chamber began to pulse with renewed strength, its light reaching up through the layers of rock and earth to connect with its scattered siblings. As each crystal returned to its proper place in the network, reality began to stabilize. The tears in the fabric of existence started to heal, the boundaries between realms returning to their proper, permeable state. Through their enhanced awareness, Ethan and Ryan could see the effects rippling outward across the mountains. Plants that had been caught in accelerated time loops settled back into their natural rhythms. Animals that had fled the chaos began to return, drawn by the restored harmony they could sense in the land. Guardian's light expanded further, showing them visions of how the crystal network had first been created. They saw the ancient Guardians, beings of both physical form and pure energy, establishing the system that would allow both realms to coexist in balance. Now that same power flowed through them, not as something to be controlled, but as a partnership between nature's forces and those chosen to maintain their harmony. Ryan's gift allowed him to hear the voices of those ancient guardians, their wisdom flowing into him like a river of knowledge. "They're showing us how to strengthen the network," he said, his voice carrying ethereal overtones. "Not just restore it, but evolve it for a new age." Ethan's connection with nature had deepened beyond anything he had imagined possible. He could feel every living thing on the mountain as extensions of himself, all part of the greater symphony of life. Through this connection, he understood how to help the crystal network adapt to the modern world without losing its essential purpose. The fragments of reality that had been torn apart began to reweave themselves, but not exactly as they had been before. The boys could see how their own understanding, their blend of modern perspective and ancient wisdom, was helping to create something new. The crystal network was evolving, becoming more resilient while maintaining its crucial role in keeping the forces of nature in balance. Diana's research team watched in amazement as their instruments recorded something unprecedented, a perfect harmony of energies that their technology could detect but could never have created. The data they were gathering would revolutionize their understanding of natural law, not through control, but through respect and cooperation. "I understand now," Diana said softly, removing her damaged harness. "We weren't meant to harness these forces. We were meant to learn from them, to work with them." She looked at her life's work with new eyes, seeing how her ambition had nearly disrupted something far more precious than any technological advancement. Guardian's form began to shift again, but this time it wasn't just the ancient spirit revealing itself. The boys could see how their own energy had become permanently entwined with his, creating a new kind of guardian, one that could exist in both worlds, understanding both the physical and the ethereal. The mountain itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the last crystal settled into its proper place. The network hummed with renewed strength, its sacred geometry now visible to those who knew how to see it. But it was different now, more adaptive, more resilient, ready to face the challenges of a changing world while maintaining its essential purpose. Around them, the facility's walls had become transparent, revealing the layers of reality that would forever be part of their awareness. They could see how every action, every choice created ripples through both realms. It was a responsibility they now understood fully, but it was also a gift, the ability to help maintain the delicate dance between the forces that made all life possible. As the last echoes of chaos faded, replaced by the subtle music of natural harmony, Ethan and Ryan shared a look of deep understanding. They were no longer just two boys with unusual gifts. They had become something new, modern guardians for an ancient trust, bridges between worlds, keepers of a balance that was more important than ever in a rapidly changing world. Guardian stood beside them, his form now able to shift seamlessly between physical and ethereal manifestations. Through their permanent connection with him, they could feel the approval of generations of guardians who had come before. The crystal network was safe, and more than that, it was renewed, strengthened, ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, the first rays of sunlight revealed a world transformed. Not in its physical appearance, the mountains still stood majestic against the sky, the forests still stretched across the valleys, but in the subtle harmony that now flowed visibly through every aspect of nature for those who could perceive it. In the months that followed the restoration of the crystal network, Ethan and Ryan grew into their roles as the new guardians with Guardians' continued guidance. Their gifts had evolved beyond their original abilities, allowing them to maintain the delicate balance between the physical world and the realm of pure natural forces. Diana Whitmore had transformed her research facility into something entirely different, a center for studying the harmony of natural systems rather than attempting to control them. We're learning more by working with these forces than we ever did trying to harness them, she explained to the boys during one of their regular visits. Her team now included both Jack and Ryan's father, their practical knowledge of the mountains proving invaluable in understanding the subtle ways the crystal network influenced the ecosystem. The altar chamber had become a place of learning, where Ethan and Ryan could commune with the ancient guardians through Guardians' enhanced connection. The crystalline formations in its walls now pulsed with a steady, healthy light, reflecting the strengthened state of the entire network. Hannah discovered that her garden had become something of a wonder, with plants responding to the restored natural energies in extraordinary ways. She understood now why she had felt such an immediate connection to Ethan all those years ago. Some part of her had recognized the guardian spirit within him, even as a baby. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood at the edge of the lake where they had first discovered one of the hidden crystals. Its surface was mirror smooth, reflecting the perfect blue of the sky above. Through his enhanced perception, he could see the crystal below, pulsing in perfect harmony with its siblings throughout the mountains. "It's amazing how different everything looks now," Ryan said, joining him at the water's edge. Animals moved comfortably around them, deer drinking from the lake, eagles soaring overhead, even the shyer creatures that usually avoided human contact. They were no longer just observers of nature, but part of its living symphony. Guardian padded silently to stand between them, his form shifting subtly between physical and ethereal. Through their shared connection, they could feel his pride and satisfaction. The ancient spirit had completed its mission, not just in protecting Ethan as a baby, but in preparing both boys for their destiny as guardians of natural law. The crystal network had evolved, becoming more resilient and adaptive while maintaining its crucial purpose. The boys had learned to sense approaching imbalances before they could become serious, working with the forces of nature to maintain harmony in ways that bridged ancient wisdom with modern understanding. Sometimes in quiet moments, Ethan would catch glimpses through the crystal network of his mother, not as she was now, but as she had been, making the difficult choice to leave him where Guardian could find him. He understood now that she too had been part of this greater purpose, her own connection to the crystal network, guiding her actions to ensure the next generation of Guardians would arise when needed. Diana had found her own path of redemption, turning her brilliant mind to understanding rather than controlling. Her research now focused on documenting the intricate ways in which natural forces maintained balance, helping others appreciate the delicate harmony that existed all around them. The data from her instruments, showing the perfect resonance of the crystal network, had revolutionized scientific understanding of natural systems. As they stood by the lake, all three connected by bonds stronger than mere friendship, they felt the pulse of the heart crystal deep within the mountain. Its rhythm was the heartbeat of the natural world itself, a reminder of the eternal dance between physical form and pure energy that made all life possible. The mountains would always face new challenges: humanity's impact on the natural world, the ever-changing dynamics of progress and preservation. But now they had guardians who understood both worlds, who could help maintain the balance while adapting to the needs of a changing planet. Guardians' forms shimmered in the morning light, and through their connection, the boys received a vision of the future, not a fixed path, but a series of possibilities all flowing from this moment of perfect harmony. They saw generations of new guardians yet to come, each building on the foundation they had helped to create. The crystal network pulsed with renewed strength, its sacred geometry now a living part of both boys' awareness. They were no longer just Ethan and Ryan. They had become something more, bridges between worlds, keepers of an ancient trust made new again through their understanding and dedication. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light catching the subtle energies that flowed between the crystals, both boys smiled at the path that lay ahead. They were guardians now, protectors of the delicate balance between worlds, and their journey was really just beginning. The end of this chapter was just the beginning of an eternal story, one that would continue as long as there were forces of nature that needed to be kept in harmony, and guardians with the wisdom to maintain that precious balance. Dear viewers, we hope this tale of harmony, transformation, and the delicate balance of nature has touched your hearts. Just as Ethan and Ryan discovered their true purpose, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Subscribe to our channel and click the like button to support more enchanting stories like this one. The Crystal Network may be fiction, but the importance of maintaining harmony with nature is very real. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you discovered you had a special connection with the natural world? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these magical tales to life. Until our next adventure,